Sorry, I'm going to actually just move it well out of the way. So I'm a short story writer and novelist, and this slide gives you a list of my publications. I've written 3 short story collections. They're listed there. Catching the Barramundi, The Settling Earth, Artifacts and Other Stories. And I've got a new collection out with Dahlia Books next year. I'm also a novelist, and 2 books of mine were out. One in 2016 called The Bishop's Girl, which is a historical mystery, and Beyond the Bay, which is an accompanying piece of work to the short story collection The Settling Earth. So some characters repeat in that book, and that's historical. And I've got a novella that came out last year called Quillac, and that was quite a different piece of writing for me. That was science fiction-y, quite dystopian, so a bit different, and that came out last year. Just a little bit about my background. So I've been longlisted for the Edgehill Prize in 2013 and 2015. The Edgehill Prize is the only short story award in the UK for short story collections. So it's run by the Edgehill University. I was very pleased to be longlisted. And I've won the Fowey Festival of Words and Music short story competition. That used to be known as the Daphne du Maurier Festival. So I'm really pleased to get that. And you'll see some more of my short listings. Chipping Norton, Evesham, Black Pear Press, which is a small publisher. And I've been longlisted for the University of Sunderland Short Story Awards. So I've got quite a background in short story writing, and I'm very pleased to share my experience with you today. So, some interesting quotes about short stories, which I hope you find interesting. First one, this guy Paolo Bacigalupi is an American-Italian writer, and he writes science fiction, but he wrote this, he said this quote about short stories, which I thought was really apt. Short fiction seems more targeted, hand grenades of ideas, if you will. When they work, they hit, they explode, and you never forget them. I think we all know what that means. When you read a short story that lingers with you, it really has an impact, even though it's a small piece of work. And then Neil Gaiman, his quote, which I'm sure I don't need to tell you who Neil Gaiman is. And I thought this was a good, fun quote. The short story is still like the novel's wayward younger brother. We know that it's not respectable, but I think that can also add to the glory of it. That idea of not being respectable is really intriguing. Maybe we can talk at the end about what that means, what that suggests to you. But to me, it sort of suggests experiments and things that are not quite fitting within the novel box. So you can play around with short stories. I thought that was quite a fun quote. A couple more. Emma Donoghue, who wrote Room, and many others. The great thing about a short story is that it doesn't have to trawl through someone's whole life. It can come in glancingly from the side. And I think that's really true about short stories. They don't have the space for you to have a big backstory. You are immediately, in lots of short stories, you right in there in the middle. And I think that's a very interesting quote as well. See, somebody's just popped something in the chat. What's the maximum number of words for a short story? I'm going to come to that in the next slide. Okay. Well, a few more slides, but we'll get to that. I'm going to cover some things about short story writing. And this last one from O. Henry, I'll give you the whole secret to short story writing. Here it is. Rule 1, write stories that please yourself. There is no rule 2. I thought that was fab. Brilliant. Gives you that freedom to just write what you like. So you don't need to conform. And the words in bold at the end are my perspective on this. A short story is a glimpse into a wider world, like peering through a door left ajar. It captures a mood, a feeling, and it makes the readers work for answers. And as we go through, I hope to demonstrate how that works. Some examples of famous short story writers. I'm sure you've all got your own favourites, and here are a few of mine. Catherine Mansfield, a New Zealand writer, a modernist. She wrote a lot about New Zealand, and I've listed some that you could go to: At the Bay, Prelude, The Doll's House. I'm going to talk a little bit about The Doll's House later. She was very young when she died, but I think she was a wonderful writer, and I really like the New Zealand ones out of all of her collections. Then we've got D.H. Lawrence, East Midlands lad. We know he wrote about mining towns, about the harshness of mining life. He also wrote some fab short stories, such as The Odour of Chrysanthemums and The Virgin and the Gypsy. So you can always go back and read those if you've not had a chance. Carol Shields, a Canadian writer, sadly passed away in 2003. And she's known for her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Stone Diaries, which I love. But she also wrote many short stories, and there's lots of collections out there. I find she does focus on relationships, marriages, smaller, when we say small lives, I mean day-to-day domestic settings that have great resonance. Dressing Up for the Carnival is one of her stories and her collections, so a great read if you get a chance. Alice Munro, I'm sure we all know Alice Munro. Again, she's focused. She does a lot of her stories focusing on small towns. She does switch in time periods in her writing. She won the Nobel Prize a few years ago for writing. Another Canadian writer. I think she's fantastic. David Maloff, he's an Australian. He's a very powerful, strong writer. He writes longer short stories, wide-ranging in their scope and setting. His collection, Every Move You Make, is one of my favourite. I would encourage you to try him out. And Anthony Doerr, I came across Anthony Doerr when he won the Sunday Times Short Story Award. I think it was their inaugural one a few years ago, and he won about £30,000 for one short story. And I had to read it because I wanted to know what's a short story that can get you £30,000. And when I read it, I could absolutely see why he won that. It's the short story that was called The Deep, and it is absolutely fantastic. It's so moving, and he's done a couple of collections, The Memory Wall and The Shell Seekers, so try him out. Lastly, Sarah Hall, love her short stories. She's won the BBC Short Story Award a few times. And Kevin Barry, an Irish writer, he's very funny. He writes really comedic short stories, so try him out. Okay, so the question that was asked, how long is a short story? There's no hard answer to that, and I would say it depends on your audience. If you're writing for competitions, a lot of them have a word limit, can be between 2,000 to 5,000 words. If you're writing for an online publication, they'll ask for around 2,000 words. Flash fiction can be anything between 250 to 1,000. Novella is about 10,000, and then you're going into the novel territory with 50,000 words plus. So it really does depend where you want to have that story published. And I would say if you're writing something and you don't think you can end it at that point, carry on writing. So just check out what the requirements are for the place that you'd like to send it to. So when you write a short story, something to consider is the importance of the title of a short story. So interesting titles stand out. If you're sending a story off to a competition or a journal, they might have lots of entries. You could have lots of stories that have got similar titles. So if your story stands out, then the editor will notice it. And I've said on here, titles are your shop window. They'll make the reader pick the story up. I know from my own experience, if I've got an anthology, I'll read through the contents list and I'll pick up a short story that's got an interesting title. So you might do the same. I would suggest that titles are easy to remember. I've read a couple of books that I can never remember the title of, but I thought were brilliant, but were difficult to remember. So I would suggest choose one that's quirky but is easy to remember. Do you have a pun in your title? Yeah, have a pun. It's up to you. But also you can use your title to explain something about the story itself. It can provide that framework. For example, I wrote a short story called Defibrillate, and that's in my collection, my last collection in Artifacts. And that title explained what was going on with the character in the story, about how she was trying to restart her life with that idea of defibrillation. So they can be useful as an aid to framing and understanding your story. So I've given some examples here of some intriguing titles. These aren't just short stories. I'm sure you can think of some. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Catch-22, The Butcher's Perfume, that was a Sarah Hall short story that won the BBC competition. What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. I mean, these are really quirky, different, but memorable titles. So when you come to writing your short stories, have a think about what your title will be. The importance of a first line in a short story is similar to when you write a novel. This is your opportunity to hook your reader and get them to want to read more. And if you're sending your story away to journals, sorry, I'm just going to ignore that. If you're sending your story away to a journal, the first line will allow you to grab your editor, and it will connect with that editor and make it stand out. The first line could refer back to a backstory or a wider context. It can have a bit of intrigue to it that will make the reader want to read on. So here we go, some examples of some brilliant first lines. It wasn't until after we burnt her that Layla began to cause trouble. That was the first line from Catherine Menyon's short story that won the Leicester Short Story Writers Award about 3 years ago. And I thought that was just brilliant. It really hooked me. I was on the judging panel for that. So that's the kind of cracking, a real sizzling first line. I'm sure you know George Orwell. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. What an opening. Of course you want to read more. And then The Crow Road by Ian Banks. I love this book. It was the day my grandmother exploded. You know, that's so interesting to a reader. It will immediately make them want to read more. Okay, so types of short stories. So these are the kind of short stories that, the shapes to short stories that I can identify. And I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail, and hopefully this will help you frame or come to understand what kind of thing you're writing. So there are 3 different types that I'll talk about today. The big reveal, that's the first one. That's where something is revealed at the end of a story. That could be a truth or an identity. And clues will come about that reveal throughout the story, be peppered throughout. So you've got to connect the dots. So you're dropping clues for your reader. Then another type of short story is the central or the recurring metaphor. That's where you have a repeated metaphor at play throughout the story. And it can affect the shaping, it can affect the language, it can affect the narrative or the dialogue. With these stories, you don't always have a resolution at the end or everything being tied up neatly. It can be ambiguous, but what's satisfying about the story is the use of the metaphor. And then the third type is what I would class as the plat. This is where you might have 2 different time frames working. So you've got different characters coming in, possibly giving different points of view, but they're all linked together. So it's quite distinct, but all linked, and it all adds to the overall understanding of the story. Okay. I'm aware I'm giving you quite a bit of info here. So again, these slides will get PDF'd and sent out to you, so you can come back to them and have a look later. Okay, so talking about the big reveal. So this is this will be a story where there's this resolution or an outcome, and you've got hints laid throughout. So a type of a reveal at the end could be where somebody's identity is revealed, if a character is mysterious throughout the story about who actually they are. A character might confess. A character might realise something, might realise why somebody is behaving in a certain way. The story could be about them trying to understand why someone has acted like that, and then the realisation is at the end. Or they could make a discovery of something. So there's lots of stories like that, and this is one kind of framework that you can put around it. And one example of this kind of big reveal framework is a story by Shirley Jackson called Charles. So I'll read this small bit. It goes over 2 slides. How was school today? I asked, elaborately casual. All right, he said. Did you learn anything? His father asked. Laurie regarded his father coldly. I didn't learn nothing, he said. Anything, I said. Didn't learn anything. The teacher spanked a boy, though, Laurie said, addressing his bread and butter. For being fresh, he added, with his mouth full. What did he do? I asked. Who was it? Laurie thought. It was Charles, he said. He was fresh. The teacher spanked him and made him stand in the corner. He was awfully fresh. And then a bit further on in the story, the mother is talking to the teacher. Well, we had a little trouble adjusting the first week or so, she said primly, but now he's a fine little helper, with occasional lapses, of course. Laurie usually adjusts very quickly, I said. I suppose this time it's Charles's influence. Charles? Yes, I said, laughing. You must have your hands full in that kindergarten with Charles. Charles? She said. We don't have any Charles in the kindergarten. So what's the realisation here? Well, of course, the realisation is Laurie is displacing his naughtiness onto an imaginary child. So the mum realises at the end, and the reader realises alongside with her, that Laurie is occasionally a naughty boy, and there's no Charles in the kindergarten. It's Laurie that's the one. So this is a really well done reveal story, and there's a lot of humour that adds to it. It can add quite a deep, profound meaning to it, as you'll see if you read the story, and you'll see that the mother is portrayed sympathetically as a supporting character in this, but then there's still that realisation at the end. So that's one type of short story that you can write where you have that realisation. Moving on to stories with a central metaphor. So these are stories that revolve or have repeated metaphors throughout. Now, a metaphor could be physical, where you've got the light, for example, that's put in various rooms or in various characters' hands and what it represents to that character. Or water could appear in a story, or anything physical. It could be an emotional metaphor, where there's the metaphor of loss that repeats throughout a story. One of those could be Memory Wall by Anthony Dewar. You could have the metaphor of fracture or change. So lots of your language in the story could be about change and disruption. Or you could have a figurative metaphor, so something about time changing. Again, I'll refer to The Deep by Anthony Dewar. So he plays with time and moves back and forth through his story. So what I would suggest when you write stories that have got a central metaphor, you'll see the metaphor feeding its way into the narrative in the language, sometimes even in characters' names. And the use of that metaphor and what it means is key to the story, rather than coming to a resolution or a big reveal at the end. So your endings can be ambiguous, but it's the inner feelings, the inner life of the character that's prefaced and that's had the focus on in these stories. But you have to do this quite well in order to be satisfying to the reader. You're not giving them a resolution or a big reveal. What's satisfying to them is the language that pulls them through the story. Okay. So through that, through the use of a metaphor, you can unpick and unravel layers of meaning and understanding to the story. One example of this is The Doll's House. in this story by Catherine Mansfield, there were two poor girls who were treated quite badly by their peers. And then they were given a glimpse of a richer, much more privileged way of life. And it was the image of the lamp, a lamp in a doll's house that signified richness that they could see, but it was not quite attainable. And here we are, the poor girls are the Kelvies, and the richer children who own the doll's house are called the Burnells. When the Kelvies were well out of sight of Burnells, they sat down to rest on a big red drain pipe by the side of the road. Lil's cheeks were still burning. She took off the hat with the quill and held it on her knee. Dreamily, they looked over the hay paddocks past the creek to the group of wattles where Logan's cows stood waiting to be milked. What were their thoughts? Presently, our Else nudged up close to her sister, but now she'd forgotten the cross lady. She put out a finger and stroked her sister's quill. She smiled her rare smile. "I've seen the little lamp," she said softly. Then both were silent once more. Okay, so that section there, the use of the metaphor and the way that the children are positioned at the edge of the environment, so out of sight of the Burnell's house, on the edge of the paddock, conveys this sense of emotion and sympathy with the girls. Use of the words like dreamily and forgotten, it gives that sense of distance, of being set apart, and that creates the space where that strong metaphor of a lamp really stands out. And it, as I've said on here, it works as a beacon to highlight what they don't have, what they're removed from. And then the third type of short story that I've identified is something called a plait. This is where you've woven different narrative strands or different characters together to form an overarching whole short story. So examples of different narrative strands could be stories set in different historical times, whether you've got a switch in narrative voices between characters, but they all work together and they come together at the end. Plait techniques can add depth to the whole story. But just a word of warning with this, they need to be handled carefully. Try not to get confused when you write your short stories with this plait structure, and keep driving the narrative on through the plait structure. So if you're doing a time plait, move it on along the timeline. And one example I've given is from a story called There Are Precious Things by Alison MacLeod. And this is a story that was set on a tube line. It's quite interesting. She got different points of view. So the plait technique was different characters, their thoughts and inner monologues woven together, and they all formed this one narrative structure. So, for example, Clifton presses Alice's photo booth picture to his chest. Lionel shelters the sample in his shirt pocket. Sister Kate looks up from her knitting and almost weeps at the sound of Edgar's gentle murmurings. Gaude gloriosa Demeter, rejoice. In Tanisha's bag, Obi's letter to Father Christmas is safely stowed. When the little boy in the woman's lap squirms again and drops his toy, a plastic dinosaur, Tanisha bends quickly to retrieve it, jiggling his foot as she passes it to him. The boy's mother turns, her face hard. Who said you could touch my son? I'm sorry, says Tanisha. She cannot get her English out quickly enough. She cannot say in Nigeria, children and old people are meant to be loved by everyone. It's a lovely story. I would encourage you to read it. There's lots of characters in here and it could become confusing, but actually the way that MacLeod handles it is really seamless. You move between different points of view quite easily. So you could have stories that have different characters that can still be interlinked within a plait technique. So, for example, in my short story collection, which is called The Settling Earth, there are lots of different characters in each short story, but they refer to each other throughout. So what I suggest is the book works like a kind of domino effect. So each story knocks into the other and it gives a different meaning. Interpretations can be built about the whole bunch of characters and the whole setting. You might have a character that does something in one story where their actions seem out of place, but then a character in a later story explains it, and you can go back and understand why that character's acted in a different way but earlier. And then you can also have resolutions about earlier characters in later stories. So it's quite a fun technique. But yeah, just it's got to be carefully handled. So just have a good editing eye over it. Okay, so moving on, the importance of a good ending. As a reader, you like to be satisfied at the end of a story. That you put the time into it. The ending will be the payoff for that reader. But that doesn't mean the ending has to be a big reveal, like I said earlier, or emphatic. It can be an ambiguous ending. It can be a closing off of a metaphor, but it should pull the different strands of your story together, help it make sense. And with short stories where every word counts, I would suggest the last few sentences really try and have a powerful few lines that pack a punch, that means something. You've got not got a lot of space in a short story, so you need to make your ending really count and be as valuable as the beginning. So a powerful ending will strike an emotional chord with the reader. So if you've got a resolution or a big reveal, the reader hopefully will have felt invested in the character to understand why that reveal means something. Maybe an ending won't be confusing. Not saying it has to be conclusive, but it won't make the reader think, well, what's happened here? They'll either know that there's ambiguity and they can consider that ambiguity, or they'll have a resolution. You could shock or surprise your reader, but in a satisfying way, or you could hint at something more to come. You might want to write more. There might be an ending that hints at another story that might come along to entice your reader to follow up on your work. So I've given some examples of good endings, not just in short stories, but in lots of books that really stand out. I had to stick something in from The Great Gatsby here because this is my favourite book in the whole world. And the ending from The Great Gatsby is, "And so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." And I would say that suggests the relentlessness of life, that we'll continue, that perseverance, will go against the current. And that really answers questions for the sadness and tragedy that had come earlier in the book. And then Animal Farm. "The creatures outside look from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which." And that refers to the foreboding of what's happened earlier in the book, and the disappointment with this grand utopia that had been set up that didn't come to it. So it's it packs a punch. It's a powerful ending. Okay, so I've rattled through the structures and formalities of writing short stories. I will finish this part of it by saying these are things that have worked for me. You can throw all of these ideas out the window. You pick out of this what works for you. None of it might, some of it might. But this is what's worked for me, and this has been my experience that I've shared with you. When you've written your short stories, you want to think about where you want to send them to. And there are some helpful websites, which I've listed here. Duotrope, it's a very good website where you can find publishers, journals, short story websites that will publish in your genre. It's really easy to use. You can search within it for your genre. You can search within it for length of story, what country country you want the publisher to be in, whether it's paid for or not. It is a subscription-based service, and it's about £4.50 a month. But I pay up, and I think it's really worth it. What also is really useful is this website, Poets and Writers. There's loads of lists on there about sources for short story writers, and that's all free. Go and have a look. Twitter is a great resource for finding out where you can publish a short story. You will see lots of journals on there if you follow them that put out tweets to say when they're open for submissions. And I would say, if you're lucky enough to get published by a short story journal or online publication, don't be afraid to send them more stuff. Use the same publisher again and again. I've done that, and it helps you build up that relationship with your publisher. Okay, I would suggest that you read and adhere to the guidelines of the places that you send it to. Short story places have lots of submissions, and they have to be, they scrutinise and have to pick short stories they want. You don't want to put yourself out of the running by not getting the basics right. So look at what they want in terms of font size and word count. Do they want your name on the story or not? Do they need page numbers? Do they want a cover letter? A cover letter for a short story can be really basic, where you just say, dear whoever, and find the editor's name if you can. This is the story I'm submitting to your journal. Here's a brief biography of myself. Thank you very much. That's all it needs. Sometimes they would like a cover letter, and sometimes they won't. And sometimes they'll ask for a biography of yourself. Increase your chances. So send out, I would advocate you send out simultaneous submissions. By that I mean send out one story to more than one place. Loads of short story places will fully expect you to do this. Excuse me. They won't expect you to just send it to them and wait for them to decide, wait 3 or 4 months. It's quite the norm for you to send out to more than one place. Put that you're doing it in your submission email or your cover letter, and then withdraw your story if you get it accepted elsewhere. Be aware of your rights. So the bottom point I've put on here is don't give away copyright, and I think that's very, very important. Excuse me. Don't sign away copyright to your short story. You shouldn't be asked. I'd be very surprised if you are, but don't give away full copyright. What publishers, short story websites like to have is exclusive rights for online publication for a period of time, and that's known as first serial rights. A lot of places that I send my stories to, they like the first serial rights for 3 months, and then after that it's free for you to send to wherever you want. So just look at what the publication asks for, because each one's different, but don't sign away your copyright. Keep that, make sure that's yours, because you might want to do something with that story later. And keeping track. It is important to record where you've sent your short stories, particularly when you're doing simultaneous submissions. Use a spreadsheet, a basic spreadsheet where you've got the title of your story and the place you've sent it to, the date you sent it to them. That can be helpful if you ever need to follow up, and the outcome. You can use Submittable. This is a website that a lot of journals use, where you can submit your stories through that journal. And it's a good way of keeping track. It's free. You just set up an account on there, so you could track your stories that way. If you want to do it old-fashioned way, have a notebook, but just keep track of where you've sent them. Okay, and that is the end of my talk today. I hope you found it interesting. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm open to questions. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask on here? I hope you can all still hear me. So Catherine has asked, do you ever go by gut feeling when you get a story? Are you able to, if you want to, Catherine, are you able to come on the microphone and just so I understand what you mean when you say, do I ever go by?
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, when I'm reading short stories, I tend to have a gut reaction to some of them where it's the kind of story I like to read. How does that affect you when you're judging competitions? Because presumably your gut reaction towards a story, it may not be the best one that's the best in terms of technical, but it may have something that hits you. How do you sort of distinguish between that gut feeling of I like this story and the technical sides of it for judging?
It's a good question. I think ultimately when it comes to judging, I just look at the quality of the writing. So my short stories are they've been described as quite traditional. So apart from my novella, I don't dabble in sci-fi, and I don't write horror stories. But I've read competition entries that are in that genre, which I wouldn't normally have read. But what stands out for me is, does the story convince me? Is the dialogue strong? Is it believable? Is there some beauty in the language? Is the comedy well timed? One of those things or all of those things. That's how I judge a short story competition. I try and park my bias for the types of things I like to read at the door. One of the joys with the Leicester short story competition is there was such a plethora of genres out there, and also formats and points of view, first person, third person stories that were sent in, and they're all really well done when I came to read the long list. So yeah, for me it's I have to put it all about the quality of the writing, whether or not it's a genre I'm more comfortable in or not. So I hope that answers that question. So Lady M has asked, where do you get your ideas from? Oh, anywhere. Gosh, I've had stories written where a first line has popped into my head and I've got no idea where it's going to go, and I've just pulled at the thread. I've had stories where I've stumbled across a metaphor that's really stood out. So one of my first book, Catching the Barramundi, the title story was all about a fisherman catching a barramundi. And a barramundi, I discovered quite by accident, is a fish that changes sex when it wants to regenerate. So it starts off life as male and changes to a female in order to spawn. And that whole sense of fracture and disruption, because that's a massive change, I found really interesting and intriguing. So that became a metaphor that I carried through in other stories. How could I explore fracture and change and something coming suddenly, or something, a change happening gradually? So yeah, it could be metaphor, it could be something I've seen on the news. I've written lots of stories about the First World War, and I think I was inspired by that because of the centenary in 2018, and obviously from 2014 to 2018, there was a lot of information out there. I'm inspired by things, artifacts, things that have resonance and meaning. So small brooches or music boxes. So, where's that come from? What's the history? So yeah, stories come from anywhere. What I would say is, just if you get an idea, just write it out in a notebook and explore it and see what happens. Can you tell us more about flash stories? Any difference in writing them versus traditional stories? Well, flash stories is not really my genre. I have written some. I've judged a few short story competitions, flash stories. I think one of the challenges and also one of the pleasures of writing short stories is they're quite technical because of the length. So absolutely everything, every word has to count. You can't build up a backstory, you don't have the space. And I think that is even truer of flash fiction. You are really right in the heart of something, and you are very much going to get a quick snapshot in a flash fiction. So I don't think you've got any lean with that. Sorry, any fat with that. It's all very lean. That's what I meant. I've got a friend who writes flash fiction, and it can take her a whole day to hone a piece of flash fiction just because it's shorter, 100 words, 250 words. It doesn't mean it's any less difficult to write. It's very technical. So if you do that, my hat's off to you. Should a short story be just about one thing? No, it can be about anything you want. It can be about one person. It can be about a load of people in a room. It could be about one emotion, but it could be about conflicting emotions. There are no rules. It's totally up to you. What I would just say is try and make it as clear as possible for your reader. So if you're moving between characters, make sure you've named your characters, or at least there's some identifying way that the reader can make them out. But it's absolutely your story, however you want it. And Celia Francis saying, got lots of questions coming up. Do you change your instructions, guidelines, etc. with time? Do things change a lot in the short story world? So I think what you mean, do I change my stories to match the guidelines? Yes, I do. The way I work is I write a short story for me, and then I have a look to see where it would fit. That's usually how I approach short stories. But yes, I would adapt my story to fit with the formatting, for example, with how it's presented, with the font, etc. Do things change a lot in the short story world? In terms of guidelines, not really. If anything, it's made easier because a lot of places now take everything online. When I started seriously writing short stories about 15 years ago, short stories had to be posted off to places, so that made it a lot harder. You can adapt a story using a metaphor if you see a particular theme to a short story competition. So if a short story competition is about a season, and you've got a story that doesn't focus on the season, but you could maybe adapt it slightly, that's one approach to send it off to that competition. So I would say be very aware of your guidelines and adapt your story to meet that. Don't put yourself out the running by not following some basic things. And I think there's one other message that popped up. Oh, thank you. Okay, well, we were given instructions to finish round about now so that we can be ready for the next one. I am aware I've rattled through quite a lot there. I hope you found it informative, and I will make sure these slides are sent off to you and that you find them useful. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to the organisers for putting this brilliant on.